I never expected her to remember my name, let alone everything else. The corner cafe smelled like rain and old pastries, and the bell over the door jingled more sharply than I thought it would. I shuffled in, hands stuffed in my hoodie pockets, and saw her already behind the counter. She was wiping down the espresso machine with deliberate care, sleeves rolled up, a stray curl falling loose near her temple. "Ah, Jamie," she said, and her voice had that soft certainty that made me pause mid-step. She tilted her head, just slightly, like she was checking I was actually there and not just a shadow. "The usual." I nodded, surprised at how natural it felt to be known. It was a small thing, remembering my order, Americano, no sugar, but it landed somewhere deep in my chest. I leaned against the counter, hands gripping the edge like I might slide right through it if I didn't. She smiled, small, quick, and turned to pour the coffee. The sound of the milk frother hissed between us. I noticed how she paused, just for a fraction, to glance at my eyes. Then she moved, but the pause lingered. I looked down at my phone, fingers hovering over a text I never sent. It had been sitting there for hours, maybe days. Something like, "Hey, do you want to?" I didn't know. She was my friend's mom, after all. That had to mean something, right? Except I didn't know what. "I saw you running into Sam the other day," she said, voice casual, as if she'd just remembered to mention it. Her hands, steady on the counter, caught my flick of the eyes. "He's busy. You know." "Yeah," I said, trying not to overthink the twitch of my hand that brushed against the corner of my cup. "Busy," she nodded, tilting the cup slightly in my direction like an unspoken peace offering. I caught her glance resting on my sleeve, then flicking back up. That tiny look, like she had noticed the little holes in my hoodie, was enough to make my throat dry. I laughed quietly at something she said about the weather, not because it was funny, but because it felt like permission to exist here, in this space, without explanation. She laughed back, the kind of laugh that doesn't fill the room, but somehow fills a corner of her chest. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Not words, not jokes, just presence. I noticed her hands again, the way one rested on the counter while the other adjusted a strained napkin, careful, deliberate. I realized I'd been holding my cup too tightly, gripping it like it was a lifeline. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. Instead, I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so small I barely noticed it myself. The cafe door jingled again, pulling us both out of the quiet orbit we'd spun around each other. "See you tomorrow," she said, and it sounded like more than routine. She handed me the coffee, and our fingers brushed just slightly. A spark. Maybe just static. I didn't know, but I felt it anyway. I nodded, murmured, "And tomorrow." My words felt too loud. My hands, now empty, hovered near my pockets again. I stepped outside, and the city smelled like wet asphalt and gasoline. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Forgot to ask. "Want to grab a walk after work?" I froze. My heart stumbled over itself, and my fingers, suddenly clammy, hovered over the screen. I didn't know if it was her. I didn't know if I should reply, but I kept staring. And that was when I realized I had never meant to get this close. The next afternoon, I found myself lingering at the bottom of her driveway, the hum of the street quiet against the soft patter of rain. She had asked me to help carry some boxes from the garage. Just small things, she said, but I knew it was an excuse to see me. My hoodie was damp at the sleeves, and I noticed, again, how she had tucked her hair behind one ear, curling loose strands against her cheek. We moved in silence at first. I held the corner of a cardboard box awkwardly, and she adjusted the lid, fingers brushing mine for a moment longer than necessary. That little spark of contact traveled up my arm, and I felt my stomach tighten. "I used to paint when I was your age," she said suddenly, eyes on a stack of old canvases leaning against the wall. Her voice was quiet, almost private, like she hadn't intended for me to hear. Not professionally, just when things were easier. I glanced at her, seeing the faint crease near her brow. She wasn't smiling exactly, but she wasn't sad either. It was a memory she was letting float into the room, and I felt the weight of it land somewhere in my chest. "Really?" I said, trying not to sound too eager. "I wouldn't have guessed." She shrugged, careful, like she was keeping herself at a safe distance. Yeah, life gets messy. Painting didn't fix it. It just helped me see what I was feeling, I guess. I nodded. My hands tightened around the box, though it wasn't heavy. I thought about the texts I hadn't sent, the imaginary conversations I ran through in my head at night, about how wrong it was her being my friend's mom, divorced too close to my own life, but also about how impossible it felt not to notice her. We settled at the kitchen table with tea, the steam curling between us like a thin veil. She stirred hers slowly, and I traced the rim of my cup, watching her fingers flex and relax. The room felt smaller than it was, crowded with everything we hadn't said. "You're quiet today," she said, tilting her head. Not a reproach, just a note. "Just thinking," I muttered, eyes flicking to her hands again. We sipped in silence. The clock ticked somewhere behind us, louder than it had any right to be. I imagined her laughing at something private, imagined her sitting next to me on the couch in my room, imagined all sorts of things that shouldn't be imagined. I shook my head lightly and focused on the steam rising from my tea, trying not to notice how close she was sitting. When I stood to put my cup in the sink, our hands brushed. It was accidental, and yet deliberate enough to make me pause. I looked up at her. She was smiling, faint, almost imperceptible, eyes catching mine in that quiet, knowing way. "I didn't know anyone else noticed that old paint smell," she said softly. I chuckled, even though it was awkward because it was safe to laugh. Safe and dangerous all at once. I don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I kept my distance that morning, hovering near the doorway like I wasn't sure if I belonged. She was at the counter, wiping down cups, sleeves pushed up. The usual hum of the coffee machine was softer somehow, like the air had thickened. "I didn't expect you until later," she said, eyes flicking up. Brief, neutral, but something in the way she said it, like she was guarding herself, made my chest tighten. I nodded, hands shoved deep in my pockets. "Morning, thought I'd stop by early." She paused mid-wipe, not long enough to be noticeable, but just enough to make me feel exposed. I wanted to lean closer, say something to fill the silence, but the words caught somewhere in my throat. Instead, I folded a napkin, my fingers brushing the table over and over. Then the door opened behind me. "Sam, my friend." He leaned against the frame, casual, but his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. My stomach sank. Small talk followed, light and awkward, a few half-laughs that felt too loud. She smiled, polite, but I could tell the rhythm we'd started to settle into had broken. I kept my eyes on her hands, the way they rested on the counter, moving almost hypnotically, the delicate press of her fingers against the smooth wood. I imagined sliding my hand over hers. I imagined her turning and then stopping myself. Later, in the kitchen, she handed me a plate of sandwiches. We moved past each other slowly, our shoulders brushing. I felt heat crawl up my spine, but she didn't meet my gaze. She leaned against the counter, just enough, and sighed quietly, a small sound that somehow said more than anything she could have said aloud. "I've been busy," she said, almost defensive, almost distant. "You know, life stuff." I nodded, careful not to ask for more. I didn't want to push. But then she glanced at me, longer than necessary, and my heart lurched. I wanted to ask her if she ever felt this. The pull, the quiet, sudden ache when someone notices you, really notices you. But my voice faltered. The kettle whistled. I went to turn it off, and she reached for it at the same time. Our fingers touched. Quick, accidental. I looked up. She didn't pull away. Her gaze lingered on mine, just a fraction too long. The room felt smaller suddenly, cramped with all the words we weren't saying. I could feel her breath, light against the edge of my ear as she stepped around me. My hand twitched, wanted to find hers. I imagined, just for a second, leaning closer, closing the tiny gap between us. But I stopped. Half a step, half a breath, half a confession. She smiled faintly, almost apologetic, and turned away. The moment passed, but the air between us didn't. It was heavier now, charged, silent, but vibrating. I left that morning feeling every inch of distance that had crept back, wondering if we'd ever get close enough again without tripping over the world we weren't supposed to cross. I hadn't seen her for 2 days. Not at the cafe, not at the driveway, not even a text. The silence was heavy, thicker than the rain-slicked streets. I wandered, hoodie pulled tight around my shoulders. I told myself she was busy. Sam's life, her own. But every corner I turned, every cup I grabbed, I expected her to be there. She appeared finally on a park bench, under the skeletal arms of a leafless tree, holding a thermos like it was a shield. I stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to call out or just watch her breathe. "Hey," I said softly, finally, my voice a little raw. She looked up, startled. Her eyes had something I hadn't seen before, distance, but also something fragile, something exposed. "Hi," she said, quiet, too quiet. I sat on the bench beside her, careful to leave a small gap. We didn't speak at first. I traced a line on my jeans with a finger, counting the quiet seconds between heartbeats. "You haven't been by," I said finally, hesitating. Not accusatory, just noticing. She shrugged, eyes on the thermos. "I had things to do." I wanted to press, but instead I just said, "I missed seeing you." The words came out softer than I expected, almost embarrassed. She lifted her gaze then, and for a moment, the distance wavered. She tucked a stray curl behind her ear, then paused, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to look at me at all. "I didn't realize how much you cared." The confession was half spoken, half avoided. My chest tightened. I wanted to reach for her hand. I wanted to say yes, yes, I do, but I didn't. Instead, I fiddled with the zipper of my hoodie, a small, meaningless movement that said everything I couldn't. "I just like being around you," I said, too quietly, hoping she'd hear the rest. Her lips parted, like she was about to speak, and then she shook her head, pulling slightly away. "Jamie," she said, almost a whisper. Her eyes flicked to the street. "We can't." And still, she didn't move entirely. I could see her pulse in her neck, her shoulders taut with some quiet struggle. Her fingers brushed against the thermos again, lingering longer than necessary, like a silent plea. I swallowed, thinking of all the small moments, the coffee, the brushes of hands, the quiet laughter that felt like it could undo me. I wanted to close the distance, to tell her everything I'd imagined, every hesitation and every ache. But I didn't. I just sat there, letting the wind tug at my sleeves, letting the rain make the bench cold between us. And then she turned slightly toward me, eyes still searching. "Do you really know what this is?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not yet. And the question hung, suspended between us like a fragile thread. I went back to the cafe the next morning, expecting the familiar rhythm of cups and steam and her voice greeting me. Instead, the counter was empty, and a note pinned to the board caught my eye. "Sorry, I had to run early. Be back later." I frowned. Her handwriting, the small curl on the Y, was unmistakable. But something felt off. I lingered by the counter longer than usual, tracing the edge of the napkin holder with my fingers, listening to the drip of the coffee machine. She came in an hour later, looking slightly harried. Her hair was loose, a few strands stuck to her cheek, and there was a tension in her shoulders I hadn't noticed before. "Hey," I said cautiously. "Jamie." Her voice held warmth, but her eyes flicked away almost immediately. She placed a box on the counter, then leaned back slightly. I noticed the slight hesitation, the way she avoided my gaze. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "It's complicated," she said. A pause, then almost too quickly. "I didn't tell you about my daughter." I blinked, caught off guard. I'd known she was divorced, yes, but a daughter. That small revelation shifted the ground beneath me, and I felt my pulse quicken. "She's older than you think." "Almost 18, she added, voice low, careful. I nodded, words faltering. Images ran through my mind. Her home filled with someone else, someone I hadn't imagined, someone for whom I would never be normal. I could feel my excitement curl back on itself, leaving a hollow ache. She stirred her coffee, slow and deliberate, and I watched her hands flex and release, flex and release. I wanted to ask more, how often she saw her, what it meant, but the words wouldn't come. "Jamie, I shouldn't have said that," she murmured, then touched the rim of her cup lightly. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of apology, distance, and maybe, almost imperceptibly, longing. I wanted to respond, to close the gap, to reassure her I was fine, but my throat felt tight. Instead, I nodded and looked down at my hands, noticing the faint crease in my palm from gripping the edge of the counter too tightly. We lingered there, the hum of the cafe loud around us, but neither of us moving closer. She smiled faintly, distracted, then glanced at the door. Something else called her away. "See you," she said, trailing off. And just like that, she left. No more words, just the scent of her perfume lingering in the air and the empty chair where she had been. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over the screen, unsure what to type. The message stayed unsent. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused, like life forgot to finish the sentence. I found her in the kitchen that evening. The house smelled faintly of herbs and old wood, the lights soft and yellow, casting shadows across the counters. I lingered in the doorway, unsure if I had the right to be here, unsure if I wanted to risk everything for a few words. She didn't look up immediately. Her hands were busy, folding a towel, arranging mugs. I could hear the small scrape of fabric against wood. "Jamie," she said finally, voice soft, cautious. I stepped closer, hands in my pockets, trying to steady the nervous flutter in my chest. "Hey," I said. Simple. Safe. She didn't move toward me, didn't move away, just existed in the same space. My mind raced with all the things I'd rehearsed, all the things I hadn't said. I didn't stop by yesterday, I said. I wanted to, but I didn't know. My voice trailed off. She tilted her head, watching me. Her eyes softened just slightly. "You didn't stop by, and I noticed." I swallowed. My throat felt dry. I was afraid, I admitted, small, almost ashamed. Afraid of messing things up. The air between us shifted. She didn't say anything at first, just paused, letting the silence stretch long enough to make me aware of every beat of my heart, every quiet tremor in my hands. "I don't want to make this harder," she said finally, voice low. "For either of us." "I know," I murmured, leaning against the counter. I can't pretend I don't care." Her fingers brushed a cup absent-mindedly, and I noticed the faint tension in her shoulders, the little exhale she couldn't quite hide. For a moment, it was just us. No rules, no friends, no questions. Just quiet acknowledgement. She stopped, swallowed, then looked at me fully. Vulnerable, tired, human. I closed the gap just slightly. Not a step too close, just enough to let her see that my words weren't just noise. She smiled. Small, private, real. Not a flourish or a gesture meant to seduce. Just her. "Okay," she said, the words soft, almost like an agreement. Or a truce. I nodded. My hand hovered near hers, then settled on the counter instead. Safe. Enough. For now, that was all we needed. And somehow, in that simple, understated exchange, words half-spoken, gestures minimal, I felt more seen than I had in months. We didn't solve anything. We didn't erase the risk, the complications, the impossibilities. But for a moment, that quiet acknowledgement, that soft okay, held more weight than any grand declaration ever could. It was 8:47 a.m. when I walked up the driveway, coffee in hand, just like I had so many mornings before. The small bell over the door jingled softly as I entered, and she looked up from wiping down the counter, sleeves rolled, hair loose in that familiar curl over her temple. "Morning," she said, not surprised, not nervous. Just morning. Ordinary. Perfectly ordinary. "Morning," I replied, setting my cup down. Black like always. She poured hers, tea this time, and handed it to me without a word, our fingers brushing briefly over the rim. A small spark, quiet but enough. We moved through the kitchen in practiced silence, the kind that didn't need words to feel full. She stirred her tea slowly, letting the warmth curl between us, while I traced the condensation on my mug, thinking of the bench in the park, the rainy mornings, the thermos, the unsent messages, all of it. The house smelled like cinnamon and old wood, like every day we had quietly built together. I noticed the slight tilt of her head as she watched me, the small laugh at something I said under my breath, the way she always made room at the counter for me. No fanfare, No explanation. Later, we walked to the bench by the park, the one under the skeletal arms of the tree. No words at first, just the soft brush of our shoulders, the cold wind tugging lightly at our sleeves. The sun was low, soft and golden. I sipped my coffee. She sipped her tea. Time stretched without pressing, without asking. "I miss this," I said finally. Not a confession, not a declaration. Just noticing. She nodded, eyes on the horizon. Me too. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no sweeping gestures. But there was a grounding, a rhythm we had found again. A recognition that the distance, the complications, the stolen moments, they had all been worth it. She shifted slightly, nudging my hand with hers as she reached for the thermos. That small touch, a repetition of countless tiny gestures, carried all the weight we had never said aloud. And in that moment, I understood love didn't have to shout. It didn't have to erase the past or fix everything. It only had to exist quietly, persistently, like a morning ritual, like the 8:47 a.m. Coffee like the bench that held our silences. We stayed there until the light changed, until the city woke around us. I didn't feel the old ache anymore. It had softened into something warmer, steadier. Imperfect, yes, but ours. I glanced at her once, the curl of hair falling loose over her temple, the subtle smile she gave me, and I realized it was enough. And as we packed up to leave, she murmured quietly, almost to herself, "Some mornings. I'm glad for the small things." I smiled. Only I knew what she meant. Only I understood. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. Some things were carried quietly, gently, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the ordinary. And sometimes that was enough.